They say love has an expiration date. That after a certain age, after a certain amount of loss, the heart simply closes. Elena Rossi believed that. For 15 years, she believed it with the certainty of a woman who had already buried her happy ending. But on a humid Chicago July evening, when a man in a charcoal suit walked into her art restoration studio, carrying a painting that held more secrets than beauty, everything she thought she knew about her life, about her late husband's death, about the very air she'd been breathing for over a decade, shattered. This is the story of a 50-year-old widow who thought her story was over, and the billionaire mafia boss who had been writing it from the shadows all along. The humidity of a Chicago July clung to the West Loop like a second skin, turning sidewalks into breath and glass into fog. But inside Elena Rossi's art restoration studio, the air was kept at a precise chill, cold enough to preserve centuries, cold enough to make grief feel almost organized. The room smelled like aged varnish, lavender oil, and the faint metallic sting of solvents. History dissolving one careful stroke at a time. Elena sat at her walnut desk in a midnight satin robe, silver-spun hair curled softly at her jawline, hands steady as a surgeon's. A brass lamp threw warm light across a cracked 17th-century canvas like a confession. She wore no jewelry except a thin ring on a chain around her neck, her husband's, because some love didn't belong on a finger anymore. 50. That number had started to feel like a quiet sentence. Not tragic, not dramatic, just final. For 15 years, she had lived like a shadow walking through a house of echoes. She raised her daughter. She built her studio. She restored other people's masterpieces while refusing to believe her own life could still be one. Sophia would call it survival. Elena called it discipline. A bell chimed at the front door. The sound was small, polite, completely wrong for what stepped through. The man who entered did not move like a client. He moved like a verdict. Charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, expensive restraint in every detail. Salt and pepper hair combed back with the quiet arrogance of someone who never had to explain himself. His gaze swept the studio once, bookshelves, frames, pigments, the sealed humidity cabinet, then landed on Elena as if the entire room had been built to lead to her. Power had a smell, Elena realized, before he spoke. Sandalwood, and something darker, like ink from a contract that could ruin lives. "I'm looking for Elena Rossi," he said. His voice was low and controlled, a baritone that seemed to settle in the small of her back rather than her ears. Elena didn't stand. Men like this were used to people rising for them. She simply set down her scalpel, wiped her hands, and met his stare. "You found her!" A faint flicker crossed his face. Surprise, maybe. Not at her beauty. Men always noticed that. The surprise was that she didn't flinch. "I'm told," he said, "you can find the light in the darkest corners of a canvas." Elena's eyes dropped to the wooden case he carried. The leather was worn like it had been gripped too hard too many times. "I can find what's still true," she corrected. His gaze sharpened. That's exactly what I need." He placed the case on her desk and opened it. Inside lay a portrait, large, old, and expensive, the kind of piece that had once hung above an empire's fireplace. The top layer was a serene scene, a nobleman in velvet, a river behind him, the illusion of peace. But Elena saw the tension immediately, the way the pigments were stacked too deliberately, the way the cracks formed a pattern. It wasn't just a painting, it was a hiding place. "Elena," the man said softly, like he'd been allowed to use her name before she'd granted it. "This belonged to my father." His fingers hovered over the frame without touching it. I want it restored, quietly. Quietly, Elena repeated, testing the word. Art doesn't mind noise. People do. His mouth tightened. Not anger, not amusement, something like restraint. My name is Frank Nicholas, he said, and I'm prepared to pay whatever you ask. Elena didn't blink. Then you're prepared to be disappointed? She said. Because I don't charge based on what you can afford. A silence dropped between them, heavy and electric. Frank's eyes moved over her silver hair, the steadiness of her posture, the calm in her face that didn't beg to be chosen. And in that moment, Elena felt it. The shift. He wasn't here to purchase a service. He was here because something in him had already recognized something in her. Fine, he said at last. Name your terms. Elena tapped the edge of the frame. I work alone. No interruptions. No security looming at my door. And you don't ask me what I find until I'm ready to tell you. Frank's jaw flexed once, as if those terms cost him more than money. Agreed. When he turned to leave, he paused at the door and looked back. The studio light caught the planes of his face, making him look carved from certainty. You're not afraid of me, he said. Elena lifted her chin slightly. I'm 50, she replied. Fear gets tired before I do. The corner of his mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile. Then he was gone. And Elena stared at the portrait like it had just blinked. Before we dive into this story, I need your help. We're on a mission to reach 3,000 subscribers, and every single subscription brings us closer to that goal. If you enjoy stories about complicated love, about people who choose each other despite the odds, please hit that subscribe button. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Drop a comment and tell me your city or country. Building this community means everything. And knowing where you all are from makes it even more special. That night, she worked past midnight, peeling back layers of varnish with slow, reverent precision. As the solvents softened the surface, the painting began to change. Under the river's calm blue, a darker shape emerged. Under the nobleman's hand, a line that wasn't meant to be there. A map, not of land, of power. Coded symbols drawn in pigment so fine they could be mistaken for shadow. Lines connecting addresses, names, old routes, foundations of the Chicago Syndicate. Elena's breath caught. Her studio was suddenly too quiet, because this wasn't a portrait. It was a confession someone had buried in beauty. And the confession said, everything Frank Nicholas believed about his father's honor was a lie. Worse, hidden inside the map was a betrayal that had nothing to do with rivals and everything to do with family. A mark beside one coded name, the mother. Elena sat back, heart thudding, and stared at the canvas like it had just spoken her name. If Frank saw this, it wouldn't just hurt him, it would unmake him. Frank returned 2 days later. No phone call, no warning, just the bell chiming at dusk, and there he was, standing in her doorway with 2 paper cups in his hands. I brought coffee, he said. Black, no sugar. Elena looked at the cup, then back at him. I don't drink coffee after 3, she said quietly. Frank's jaw tightened slightly, not irritation, but something closer to embarrassment. What do you drink? Chamomile tea. He nodded once, as if filing that information somewhere important. Next time, he said. And Elena realized he wasn't asking permission to return. He was telling her he would. She let him in. Frank moved through the studio like a man trying to understand a foreign language. He didn't touch anything, didn't ask questions, just watched. watched her hands move across the canvas with the kind of reverence he'd never seen in his world. After an hour of silence, Elena finally spoke. "I found something." Frank's gaze sharpened immediately. She stepped aside, letting him see what she had uncovered. The map. Frank moved closer, eyes narrowing as he traced the coded symbols with his gaze. His jaw tightened. His breathing changed, shallow, controlled, like a man trying not to shatter. "Where did you find this?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Beneath the river," Elena said. "Hidden under layers of paint your father applied himself. He didn't commission this portrait. He weaponized it." Frank's hand hovered over the canvas, trembling slightly before he pulled it back. "My father built everything on loyalty," he said. "On honor." "On control," Elena interrupted gently. "Not loyalty. Control." Frank's eyes snapped to hers, dark and burning. "You don't know him." "No," Elena agreed, "but I know this." She pointed to a small mark beside one of the coded names. A symbol that appeared only once in the entire map. A rose with a broken stem. Frank's face drained of color. "That's..." His voice broke. He swallowed hard. "That's my mother's mark?" Elena nodded slowly. "Your father didn't just build the syndicate. He betrayed the woman who helped him build it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Frank turned away from the painting, his shoulders rigid, fists clenched at his sides. For a long moment, he didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there like a man trying to hold together something that had already shattered. When he finally turned back, his eyes were red-rimmed, not crying, but close. "I spent my entire life defending his legacy," Frank said, his voice raw. "I became what he wanted me to be. I sacrificed everything to honor his name." He looked at Elena with something close to desperation. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Elena stepped closer, not touching him, just present. "You stop defending what he was," she said softly, "and start deciding who you are." Frank stared at her like she had just offered him something he didn't know how to hold. "You could destroy me with this," he said quietly. Elena met his gaze steadily. "I restore art," she replied. "I don't ruin people." Something shifted in Frank's expression. The restraint slipped. The mask cracked. He took a step closer, then another, until the air between them was nothing but breath and heat and the hum of something neither of them could name. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" he asked, voice barely audible. Elena tilted her head slightly. "Because I've already lost everything that mattered. What's left to fear?" Frank's eyes searched her face. "You're wrong," he said. "You haven't lost everything. Not yet." The words hung between them. A promise or a threat, Elena couldn't tell. Then Frank stepped back, composing himself with visible effort. "I should go," he said. But he didn't move toward the door. Instead, he looked at the painting one more time, then back at Elena. "There's something you should know," he said carefully, "about your husband." Elena's breath caught. "What about him?" Frank's jaw worked, as if he was fighting some internal battle. "Not yet," he said finally. "When the painting is finished, I'll tell you everything." Then he was gone, and Elena stood frozen in the center of her studio, heart pounding, hand pressed against the ring on her chest. Because something in the way he said it felt like confession. Over the next week, Frank came back. Every night. Sometimes with chamomile tea, sometimes with nothing but silence. He sat in the corner of her studio and watched her work. Watched her hands bring light back to damaged beauty. And slowly, carefully, he began to talk. about his father's empire, about the weight of legacies, about the difference between loyalty and fear. He never touched her. But the air between them grew heavier with each visit. Elena told herself it was just companionship. Two lonely people finding solace in silence, but her body knew better. Her pulse quickened when he arrived. Her skin hummed when he stood too close. Her chest ached when he left. And one night, when Frank brought tea and their fingers brushed during the exchange, Elena felt it, the snap of recognition, the dangerous pull of something she thought had died 15 years ago. Want. She pulled her hand back quickly, but not before Frank saw the flush creep up her neck. His eyes darkened. "Elena," he said softly, but she shook her head. "Don't," she whispered, because if he said what she thought he was about to say, if he named this thing growing between them, she wouldn't be able to pretend anymore. Frank nodded slowly, respecting the boundary. But as he left that night, he paused at the door. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly, and Elena believed him. That was the most terrifying part. Sophia arrived on a Tuesday morning, unannounced. She walked into the studio in a crisp navy blazer, heels clicking against the hardwood floor, eyes sharp and assessing. Her gaze swept the room, taking in the half-restored painting, the empty chamomile teacup on the desk, the faint scent of sandalwood still lingering in the air, and landed on Elena like an accusation. "We need to talk," Sophia said. Elena set down her tools carefully. About the fact that Frank Nicholas has been here every single night this week." Elena's chest tightened. "He's a client." Sophia's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Mom, I'm not stupid. And neither are you." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Do you have any idea who he is? What he's capable of?" "He's a man who needs help," Elena said quietly. "He's the Iron Dawn," Sophia snapped. "He's not some misunderstood romantic hero. He runs half the power structures in this city. And men like him don't need help. They need control." Elena's jaw tightened. "You don't know him." "And you do?" Sophia's eyes flashed. "After what? A handful of late-night conversations? Mom, please, you're smarter than this." The words stung because they were partly true. Elena didn't know Frank, not really, but she knew the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. The way he listened like every word mattered. The way he sat in her studio like it was the only place in the world where he could breathe. And that terrified her more than his reputation ever could. "I'm not some naive girl," Elena said firmly. "I know what I'm doing." Sophia's expression softened, but the worry remained. "That's what scares me," she said quietly. "Because I think you do know, and you're doing it anyway." She pulled out her phone, scrolling to something before turning the screen toward Elena. "I've been asking around," Sophia said. Quietly, about Frank Nicholas, about his father, about the syndicate. Elena's stomach dropped. "Sophia, there are things that don't add up, Mom. Gaps in the public record, sealed files from 15 years ago, and your name keeps appearing in proximity to events I don't understand yet." Elena's blood went cold. "What are you talking about?" But Sophia just shook her head. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. Because if Frank Nicholas is dangerous, I need to know. And if he's connected to Dad's death somehow..." Her voice cracked. "I need to know that too." Before Elena could respond, her phone buzzed. A text from Frank. "Tonight, 8 p.m., I want to show you something important." Sophia saw the screen, saw the name. Her face hardened. "Mom," she whispered. Please, be careful. Elena looked at her daughter, at the fear behind the anger, at the love wrapped in warning, and felt something crack inside her chest. I will, she promised. But they both knew it wasn't enough. At 8 o'clock, a black car arrived. No driver, just Frank, leaning against the passenger door in dark jeans and a charcoal coat, looking like restraint wrapped in dangerous elegance. You came, he said, as if he hadn't been sure. You asked, Elena replied. The drive was quiet, uncomfortable in a way that felt both natural and terrifying. Frank didn't fill the silence with small talk or explanations. He just drove, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the gear shift, close enough to hers that she could feel the heat radiating between them. They didn't go to a restaurant. They went to the Gold Coast, up into a penthouse that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Sterile marble floors, floor-to-ceiling glass, furniture that looked expensive and untouched. Silence so carefully curated, it felt weaponized. The view was Chicago's skyline, cold, glittering, untouchable. Elena stood near the window and felt, for the first time in years, the urge to step back. This is where you live? She asked. Frank stood behind her, close enough that she could feel him without turning. This is where I sleep, he corrected quietly. And where do you breathe? His voice dropped, rough and honest. I don't. Elena turned slowly, meeting his gaze. The air between them was electric, dangerous. Frank's eyes traced her face like he was memorizing something he thought he might lose. Elena, he said quietly, I need you to understand something. She waited, heart pounding. Everything I've built, this penthouse, this empire, this life. He gestured vaguely at the sterile perfection surrounding them. None of it feels real. None of it means anything. He took a step closer. Until you. Elena's breath caught. Frank, I'm not asking you for anything, he said quickly. I just needed you to know that this... He gestured between them. Whatever this is, it's the first real thing I've felt in 20 years. The confession hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Elena should have stepped back, should have maintained distance. Instead, she heard herself ask, Why me? Frank's mouth curved into something sad. Because you're the only person who looks at me and doesn't see what I can give them. You see what I've lost. The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. Before she could respond, Frank stepped back, breaking the moment. I should take you home, he said. The ride back was silent, but different, because now Elena could feel it, the weight of something unspoken pressing against her ribs. The pull of a man who saw her not as a conquest, but as an equal. And when Frank walked her to her studio door, he paused. Good night, Elena, he said softly. Then he was gone. And Elena stood in the doorway, hand pressed against her chest, trying to slow her racing heart. The tabloids struck 2 days later. Someone had photographed them. Elena leaving the Gold Coast building. Frank's hand at the small of her back. The intimacy of the moment captured and twisted into something ugly. Headlines screamed, Black Widow ensnares Chicago's most powerful man? Gold digger or enchantress? Billionaire's new obsession, desperate widow, 50. They misspelled her last name, called her a predator, reduced 15 years of grief and discipline and survival to a punchline. Sophia stormed into the studio that afternoon, newspaper in hand, voice shaking with fury and fear. This will destroy you! Elena stared at the photos, at the headlines, at the vicious words meant to reduce her to nothing more than a cautionary tale. and felt something inside her go cold and hard. "Let them talk," she said quietly. But Sophia wasn't listening. Tears were streaming down her face now. "Mom, they're calling you a gold digger. They're saying you're using him, that you're—" Her voice broke. "That you're too old to be anything but desperate." The words hit like stones. Elena pulled her daughter close, holding her tight. "None of that is true," she whispered. "You know that." "But they don't," Sophia sobbed. "And now everyone will think—" She couldn't finish. Elena stroked her daughter's hair, feeling the weight of every cruel word printed on that page. But beneath the humiliation, beneath the anger, she felt something else, a wave of dizziness. Sharp, sudden, wrong. She gripped the edge of the desk, steadying herself as nausea rolled through her stomach. Sophia pulled back, eyes wide with alarm. "Mom, are you okay?" Elena nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, just tired. It's been a long week." But she wasn't fine, because her body was trying to tell her something she wasn't ready to hear, something that would change everything. "Before we continue, I need to ask you something. If you're invested in Elena's story, if you want to know what happens when a woman who thought love was over discovers she's carrying impossible hope in the most dangerous circumstances, please subscribe. Hit that button, because what comes next will shatter everything you think you know about this story. And I don't want you to miss it. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think Elena should trust Frank? Or is Sophia right to be afraid? I'll be reading every single one. The nausea didn't stop. Day after day, Elena woke with her stomach churning, exhaustion dragging at her bones like weights. She told herself it was stress. The tabloids had been vicious. Frank's nightly visits had disrupted 15 years of carefully maintained equilibrium. But 2 weeks after that first dizzy spell, when she couldn't keep down breakfast for the 5th morning in a row, she knew. No. The word echoed in her mind like a prayer that wouldn't be answered. This wasn't possible. At 50, the body closed certain doors. Menopause should have made this impossible. And yet her breasts were tender, her sense of smell heightened, her body screaming a truth she didn't want to hear. Elena drove to a pharmacy 3 neighborhoods away, bought the test with cash, avoided the clerk's eyes like a teenager buying contraband. Back in her studio bathroom, she stared at the small plastic stick like it was a loaded gun. 2 minutes to confirm what her body had been screaming. Positive. Elena sank onto the cold tile floor, breath leaving her in a single broken sound that was half sob, half laugh, because this was impossible. And yet, her first thought wasn't Frank. It was her late husband, the ghost she'd carried for 15 years, the future she'd mourned and buried, the version of herself who had believed in second chances before grief taught her better. All of it clawing its way back from the grave. She pressed shaking hands against her still flat stomach and felt tears she hadn't cried in years finally break through. Because this wasn't just pregnancy. This was proof that her heart had betrayed every vow she'd made to stay safe, stay closed, stay finished. She didn't tell Frank. Not that night when he arrived with chamomile tea and his usual quiet presence. Not when he asked if she was feeling all right, those dark eyes too observant, too careful. Not when his hand brushed hers while handing her the cup and electricity shot up her arm. Want and terror colliding in her chest. "Elena," Frank said softly, studying her face. "You're pale, and you've barely touched your tea all week." "I'm fine," she lied. Frank's jaw tightened. He set down his own cup and moved closer, crouching beside her chair until they were eye level. "I know what fear looks like," he said quietly. And you're terrified. Elena's throat closed. I'm not. Don't. His voice was firm, but gentle. Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone. The kindness nearly shattered her. Because carrying things alone was all she knew. All she'd done for 15 years. And now, there was something growing inside her that she literally couldn't carry alone even if she wanted to. But telling Frank meant making this real. Telling Frank meant pulling him into a future neither of them had planned. Telling Frank meant admitting that what started as a business transaction had become something she no longer controlled. So she stayed silent. And Frank, sensing the wall she'd built, simply nodded. When you're ready, he said, I'll be here. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. Elena, he said without turning. Whatever you're afraid of, I promise you're not facing it alone. Not anymore. Then he was gone. And Elena sat in the dark studio, hand pressed against her stomach, wondering how long she could keep a secret this impossible. The call came 2 days later. Sophia's voice, tight with urgency. Mom, I need to see you, now. I found something. Elena's chest constricted. About what? About Dad, about Frank, about everything. The line went dead. Elena barely slept that night. She kept thinking about Sophia's warnings, about Frank's confession that he'd tell her everything when you're ready, about the way he'd looked at her husband's ring around her neck like he already understood its weight. And beneath all of it, the constant, nauseating reminder that her body was creating life with a man whose past was still a mystery. Sophia arrived at dawn. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, hair pulled back severely, shadows under her eyes, a manila folder clutched in white-knuckled hands. Mom, she said, voice barely above a whisper. Sit down. Elena's blood went cold. Sophia, what? Please, just sit. Elena sank into her chair, heart hammering. Sophia opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside, photocopied police reports, newspaper clippings, sealed court documents with sections blacked out. The official report said Dad's death was random, Sophia began, voice shaking. Wrong place, wrong time, a senseless tragedy. She spread the papers across the desk. But I started digging, really digging, and there are inconsistencies. Evidence that was sealed without explanation, witness statements that were redacted, an investigation that went cold way too fast. Elena couldn't breathe. What are you saying? Sophia's eyes filled with tears. I'm saying it wasn't random, Mom. Someone with serious power made sure the truth stayed buried. Elena's hands started shaking. Who? I don't know who ordered it, Sophia said. But I know who tried to stop it, who tried to save Dad and failed, who's been paying for my education anonymously, who kept your studio funded when you thought you were barely surviving. She pulled out one final document, a bank transfer record with a name highlighted. Mom, it's Frank Nicholas. The words hit like a physical blow. The studio tilted. Elena gripped the edge of her desk, nausea surging again. But this time, it had nothing to do with pregnancy. He's been watching me? Elena whispered. Protecting you, Sophia corrected, voice breaking. For 15 years, from a distance, making sure you stayed safe, making sure I could get out of Chicago, making sure whoever wanted Dad dead couldn't touch us. Elena couldn't think, couldn't process, because suddenly everything made sense in the worst possible way. Frank's guilt, his careful attention, the way he looked at her like he'd been waiting. Why didn't he tell me? Elena's voice cracked. I don't know, but Mom... Sophia gripped her hands. This isn't normal. This isn't romantic. Whatever his reasons, he's been living a lie. And so have you. The bell at the front door chimed. Both women froze. Elena turned slowly and saw Frank standing in the doorway. He wasn't looking at Sophia, only at Elena. His face was calm, but his eyes were filled with something that looked like relief and devastation at once. Elena, he said quietly, I came to tell you the truth. Sophia moved first. She positioned herself between her mother and Frank, body rigid with protective fury. Don't, she said, voice shaking. Don't you dare come closer. Frank's eyes never left Elena. I'm not here to hurt her, he said quietly. You've been lying to her for 15 years, Sophia spat. You don't get to decide what hurts. Sophia, Elena stood, legs unsteady but voice stronger than she expected. Give us a moment. Absolutely not. Please. The word came out soft but final. Sophia's jaw clenched, tears streaming down her face now. Mom, he's dangerous. I know. Elena's voice was calm, too calm. The kind of calm that comes after shock has burned through panic. But I need to hear this from him. Sophia looked between them, her mother's pale face, Frank's rigid posture, and seemed to make a calculation. I'll be right outside, she said, voice lethal. And if I hear anything that sounds wrong, I'm calling the police. She brushed past Frank without looking at him. The door closed. Silence. Frank stood perfectly still, hands at his sides, looking more vulnerable than Elena had ever seen him. The expensive restraint was gone, the controlled power stripped away. He just looked human and exhausted. You came to confess, Elena said, not a question. Yes. Before you knew Sophia had found out. Yes. Frank's voice was rough. I've been trying to find the courage for 2 weeks. Since the night I brought you to my penthouse. Since you asked where I breathe. He took one careful step forward. The answer is, I don't. I haven't. Not for 15 years. Elena's hands clenched at her sides. Tell me. Frank exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he'd been holding too long. Your husband wasn't killed by accident, he said. He was targeted. The words landed like stones. Elena's knees threatened to give out, but she forced herself to stay standing. He'd discovered evidence, Frank continued, voice steady but pained. Financial records proving my father was using the syndicate to launder money through city contracts. Your husband was going to expose everything. My father found out. Frank's jaw clenched and ordered him killed. Elena made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob. I didn't know, Frank said quickly, desperately. Not until after. I was in New York handling acquisitions. By the time I got the call, your husband was already gone. His voice cracked. I confronted my father. We fought, physically fought. I told him I'd destroy everything he built if he touched you or Sophia. And he laughed. Frank's fists clenched, knuckles white. He said, then you'll protect them forever, because the men who want them dead don't answer to me anymore. Elena couldn't breathe. So I did, Frank whispered. I made you invisible, paid for everything quietly so you wouldn't need publicity, wouldn't draw attention, made sure Sophia got out of Chicago, watched from a distance because getting close would have painted a target on your back. He looked at her with eyes that held 15 years of longing and guilt. I told myself I was protecting you, that it was enough, that I didn't deserve more than that. And then? Elena's voice was barely audible. And then I couldn't stay away anymore? Frank's voice broke completely. I brought my father's painting because I needed an excuse to see you, to hear your voice, and to be in the same room for just 1 hour. He laughed bitterly. But then you looked at me like I was human, like I mattered, and I couldn't leave. Tears streamed down Elena's face now. You should have told me. I know. You should have. I know. Frank, her voice shattered. I'm pregnant. Frank went completely still. His entire body froze. His breath stopped. For 3 heartbeats, he looked like a man who'd just been struck by lightning. What? He whispered. I'm pregnant. Elena's hands moved to her stomach instinctively. With your child? And I don't know what to do because you're a stranger who's been watching me for 15 years and I'm terrified and angry and… She couldn't finish because Frank's knees buckled. He actually dropped to the floor in front of her. His hands reached out slowly, trembling, hovering near her hips before finally landing gently. His forehead pressed against her stomach as if she was an altar and he was a man who'd finally found religion. Elena, he breathed, voice wrecked. Elena, No words came, just a broken sound that was half sob, half prayer. Elena's hands moved to his hair without permission, fingers tangling in salt and pepper strands. And she felt it. The shift. The moment when protection and obsession and guilt transformed into something else entirely. Something that looked like love, but felt like fate. I will keep you safe, Frank whispered against her. Both of you. I swear on everything I have, Elena. No one will touch you. I will burn the entire syndicate to the ground before I let anything happen to you. Elena's chest ached. You can't promise that. Frank looked up, its eyes fierce and wet and absolutely certain. Watch me. His phone buzzed. The sound shattered the moment like glass. Frank pulled it out, face draining of color as he read. What? Elena asked, fear spiking. Frank stood slowly, every muscle in his body going rigid. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by something cold and lethal. My board knows about the pregnancy, he said quietly. Elena's heart stopped. How? They have people watching me, watching you. His jaw clenched. And the rivals are moving. He looked at Elena with something close to devastation. You and the baby are now targets. If you're still here, if you need to know whether love can survive when an empire wants you dead, subscribe right now, because what comes next is the moment Frank chooses between power and Elena, between the syndicate and the child. And I need you here for it. Comment below. I'm reading every word. Frank moved fast. Within hours, Elena's studio was surrounded by security she never saw but could feel. Shadows at the corners of buildings, cars that appeared and disappeared, the weight of invisible eyes. Sophia refused to leave her mother's side, and Frank transformed. The man who had sat quietly in her studio watching her restore paintings was gone. In his place stood the Iron Dawn, cold, calculating, lethal. He made calls in clipped tones, issued orders that sounded like death sentences, moved through Elena's space like a general preparing for war. But every few hours, he would stop, come to where Elena sat, and press his hand gently against her stomach, as if reminding himself why he was burning his entire world down. The board knows about the pregnancy, Frank said on the 3rd day, voice tight. Someone leaked the hospital records. They're calling an emergency meeting. Elena looked up from the canvas she could no longer focus on. What will you tell them? Frank's jaw clenched. The truth. And then what? Then they'll demand I choose. His eyes were fierce. The syndicate or you? Sophia made a sound from across the room. That's not a choice, Frank. That's a threat. I know. Frank's gaze never left Elena. And I've already made my decision. Elena's breath caught, because she understood what he was really saying. Power or love? The empire he'd spent his life building, or the future growing inside her. "They'll destroy you," Elena whispered. Frank's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Let them try." The gala was Frank's idea. "If we hide, they win," he'd said. "If we show them you're not afraid, that I'm not afraid, we shift the power." Elena didn't want to go, but Frank had been insistent. "One night, one public appearance, then I end this." So Elena wore midnight blue silk that draped elegantly without clinging, silver hair swept up, diamond earrings Frank had sent without asking permission. She looked like power, like a woman who belonged on a billionaire's arm. But inside, she felt like a target. The Four Seasons ballroom was a cathedral of wealth: crystal chandeliers, champagne towers, Chicago's elite in expensive gowns and tailored suits. When they entered, conversation stopped. Every eye turned. Every whisper started. The woman from the tabloids. The widow who'd ensnared the Iron Dawn. Elena's spine straightened. Frank's hand pressed against the small of her back. Warm, steady, possessive. "Breathe," he murmured. "You're the most beautiful woman in this room, and they know it." "They think I'm a predator?" "Good," Frank said quietly. "Let them think you're dangerous." They moved through the crowd like a storm. Frank introduced her to board members, rivals, politicians, each handshake a test, each smile a weapon, until Victor Marchand appeared. Silver-haired, sharp-eyed, wearing his wealth like a threat. A rival family head. The man positioning himself to take Frank's place. "Frank," Victor said smoothly, "I see you've brought your companion." The word dripped with condescension. Frank's body went rigid. "Her name is Elena Rossi." Victor's smile was surgical. "Of course, the art restorer." He turned to Elena. "Tell me, Ms. Rossi, do you ever worry some things are too broken to save?" The insult was clear. Elena met his gaze without flinching. "I find the most broken things often hide the most beauty," she said quietly. "It's the pristine surfaces you have to watch out for. They're usually covering rot." Victor's smile froze. "The board has concerns, Frank," he said, turning back, "about your judgment lately, about distractions that might compromise your effectiveness." "My judgment is sound." "Is it?" Victor's eyes were cold. "Because from where I stand, you're making choices that benefit sentiment over strategy. And sentiment gets people killed." The threat hung in the air. Frank stepped forward, voice dropping to something lethal. "Victor, I'm going to say this once. Elena is not a distraction. She is not a weakness. And if you or anyone on that board thinks they can use her to control me, you'll discover exactly why they call me the Iron Dawn." Victor's face paled slightly, but he recovered. "We'll see what the board decides tomorrow." He walked away. Elena's hand found Frank's. "He's going to make a move." "I know." Frank's jaw was tight. "That's why I'm making mine first." Elena's champagne arrived minutes later. She lifted it to her lips, then Frank's hand shot out, stopping her. "Don't." His eyes were locked on the glass, then scanning the room with predatory intensity. "Frank, what?" "Security," he said quietly into his sleeve mic. "Check the kitchen staff. Now." Within seconds, two men in suits materialized and disappeared toward the service entrance. Frank took the glass from Elena's hand and set it down. "Someone tampered with it," he said, voice deadly calm. "I saw the server's handshake, the way he avoided eye contact." Elena's blood ran cold. "Victor? Or someone working for him?" Frank's arm wrapped around her waist. "We're leaving. Now." But as they turned toward the exit, Victor blocked their path, flanked by board members. "Leaving so soon?" Victor's smile was cold. "We haven't even made the announcement yet." "What announcement?" Frank's voice was steel. "That the board has called for an emergency vote." Victor's eyes glittered. "Regarding your fitness to lead, given your recent compromised judgment." The room went silent. Every eye was on them now. Frank stood perfectly still for one heartbeat. 2. Then he smiled, a real smile, sharp as a blade. "You want to vote?" he said loudly, voice carrying across the ballroom. "Fine, but first, let me make something clear." He turned to address the entire room. "For 15 years, I've run this organization the way my father taught me, with control, with fear, with blood when necessary." His hand tightened on Elena's waist. "And I'm done." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "I'm converting my holdings into legitimate foundations," Frank continued. "Art preservation, education, housing initiatives. Anyone who wants to continue the old ways can find a new leader." Victor's face went red. "You can't just—" "I already did." Frank's smile was cold. "The paperwork was filed this morning. My lawyers are faster than your poison." He looked directly at Victor. "And if anyone makes another attempt on Elena's life, I won't use lawyers. I'll use what I learned from my father about making people disappear." The threat landed like a bomb. Victor's face drained of color. Frank took Elena's hand and walked toward the exit, the crowd parting like water. No one tried to stop them. The board convened anyway. Frank left Elena and Sophia at the penthouse, security doubled, while he went to face the vote. He was gone for 4 hours. When he returned, exhaustion lined his face, but his eyes were clear. "It's done," he said quietly. "And?" Elena stood, barely breathing. "Victor took control. I'm out." Frank crossed to her. "No more syndicate, no more empire." He cupped her face. "But I transferred everything before they could seize it. The foundations are secure. We're secure." Elena's tears came fast. "You gave up everything." "No." His voice was firm. "I gave up nothing, because none of it mattered until you." Sophia wiped her eyes from across the room. Frank looked at her. I know this doesn't erase what my family did to yours," he said quietly. "And I know you have every reason not to forgive me. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try to be the man your father would have wanted protecting your mother." Sophia's face crumpled. She didn't answer, just nodded. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a start. This is it. Frank has sacrificed everything, but will it be enough to keep them alive? If you need to know whether love can actually survive when an empire wants you dead, subscribe now. Because the ending will show you what happens when a man chooses family over power. The first 3 months were the hardest. Victor tried, subtly, carefully, to make good on his silent threat. Anonymous tips to the IRS, rumors planted in the press. Pressure on Frank's remaining business partners. But Frank had planned for this. Every attack was met with airtight legal defense. Every rumor was countered with documentation. And slowly, as Frank's foundations began to show real results, scholarships funded, buildings restored, families housed, the narrative shifted. The tabloids that had called Elena a gold digger now called her a philanthropist. The rivals who had wanted Frank destroyed realized he was more valuable as an ally in legitimate business than as an enemy. And Victor found himself isolated, his old-world tactics ineffective against a man who no longer played by those rules. By the 4th month, the threats stopped. By the 5th, Frank could breathe again. By the 6th, Elena was painting. Her studio had been transformed. Not just restored, reborn. The Art Preservation Foundation operated from the ground floor, funding restoration projects across Chicago. Elena ran it with the same precision she'd once applied to damaged canvases, bringing beauty back to forgotten places. And upstairs, in the space that had once felt like a tomb, she created her own work. For the first time in 15 years. Frank sat in his usual corner on a Tuesday afternoon, laptop open but ignored, just watching her work the way he had from the beginning. But now, he didn't have to hide why. Now he could cross the room whenever he wanted and wrap his arms around her swollen belly, feeling their daughter kick against his palms. "What are you painting?" he asked. Elena smiled, one hand resting on her round stomach. "A map," she said. Frank's eyebrow raised. "Like my father's?" "No." Elena turned the canvas toward him. "Not of power, of home." It was their studio, the penthouse, Sophia's new apartment near the university, the foundation offices, all connected by threads of gold paint, a constellation of places and people that had become their family. Frank stood, moving behind her to rest his chin on her shoulder. "It's beautiful," he murmured. "It's ours," Elena corrected. The bell chimed downstairs. Sophia's voice called up, "Mom, I brought lunch." Elena laughed, wiping paint from her hands. But before she could move, Frank caught her wrist gently. He knelt, not for the first time, but it still made her breath catch, and pulled a ring from his pocket. Raw platinum, simple, strong. "I know I already asked," he said quietly. 6 months ago, when everything was chaos and danger and fear. But I want to ask again now, when we're safe, when the dust has settled. His eyes held hers. "Elena Rossi, will you marry me? Not because I'm trying to protect you, not because you're carrying my child, but because you taught me something I'd forgotten." "What's that?" "That life doesn't have to be about surviving." His voice was soft. "It can be about living." Elena's tears came without warning. She thought about her late husband, about 15 years of grief and discipline, of believing her story was over at 50. And then she thought about the man kneeling in front of her, flawed, damaged, impossibly transformed, who had burned an empire because she'd taught him that some things were worth more than power. "Yes," she whispered. Frank's eyes closed, relief washing over his face like absolution. He slid the ring onto her finger, and this time, it felt like a promise they might actually be able to keep. When he stood and kissed her, Sophia appeared in the doorway and promptly burst into tears. "Finally," she said, laughing through the crying. "Do you know how hard it's been not asking when you were going to make this official?" Frank turned to her, expression careful. "Does this mean—" "It means I'm working on it," Sophia interrupted, voice thick with emotion. "Forgiving you, trusting you. It's not easy, Frank. You're connected to the worst day of my life." She wiped her eyes. "But you're also the reason my mom is happy for the first time in 15 years. So, yeah, I'm working on it." Frank nodded, throat working. "That's all I can ask for." Sophia crossed the room and after a moment's hesitation hugged him. It was brief, awkward, but it was real. 3 months later, they were married. Not in a cathedral or a ballroom, but in the studio where everything had begun, surrounded by paintings in progress, restoration tools, and the smell of lavender oil and solvents. Sophia stood beside her mother, 7 months pregnant now, glowing in ivory silk. And Frank. Frank looked at his bride like she was the only solid thing in the universe. When the officiant asked for vows, Frank spoke first. I spent 45 years building an empire, he said, voice steady, and 5 minutes falling in love with you. And I learned something. Power is what you take. Love is what you choose. He squeezed her hands. Every day, Elena, I choose you. Elena's turn. I thought my story was over, she said, tears streaming freely. I thought 50 meant finished, but you taught me that life doesn't end when we think it does. It just transforms. She smiled through the tears. So here's my vow. I will spend every day we have left showing you that the man you've become is worth infinitely more than the empire you left behind. They kissed as husband and wife. And in that moment, surrounded by art and family and the future kicking insistently against Elena's ribs, Frank Nicholas finally breathed. A year later, Elena stood in the studio's evening light, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, watching Frank on the floor with their daughter. Lucia was 8 months old, dark curls, her father's eyes, and a grip strong enough to make grown men wince. Frank was teaching her to stack blocks, his voice soft and patient, completely transformed from the man who had once commanded empires with a phone call. You're staring, he said without looking up. I'm remembering, Elena corrected. Remembering what? The first night you walked in here. How you looked at that painting like it held all the answers. Frank glanced up, smile soft. It did, he said. It led me to you. Elena crossed to them, sinking down onto the floor beside her husband and daughter, feeling the pleasant ache of a body that had carried life and the deeper satisfaction of a heart that had learned to open again. What do you think happens next? She asked. Frank gathered both of them close, wife and daughter, his entire world contained in the circle of his arms. I don't know, he said honestly. But for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid to find out. And Elena Rossi, artist, restorer, mother, wife, realized something profound. The greatest stories don't always start at 20. Sometimes they start at 50, when you've survived everything, when you've already buried happy endings, when you're finally brave enough to believe that what comes next might be even better than what came before. They say love has an expiration date, that after loss, the heart closes forever. But Elena taught Frank something the world forgets. The most powerful transformations happen when we choose love over everything we thought defined us. When we burn down empires to build homes. When we trade control for connection. And sometimes, the greatest love story of your life begins the moment you stop believing it's possible.